Light a campfire and everyone's a storyteller. Join us for some thought-provoking and beyond fireside chats.
Today I am joined by Vincent van der Merwe. He is the manager of the Cheetah Metapopulation Project, which does so much crucial work in managing and conserving Africa's cheetahs. And we are going to be chatting about cheetah as a species, the efforts being made to protect and conserve them, and all the stories and challenges that come with that mandate. Vincent, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks very much, Josh. It's great to be here. And hopefully we can clarify some things with regards to wild cheetah management and the potential reintroduction into India.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. So I think maybe, Vincent, one of the best places to start is with the question of what is the current conservation status of cheetahs and what challenges are they facing?
Well, basically, wild cheetahs have been extirpated from 91% of their historical distribution range. They used to be found right across Southern Africa, East Africa, West Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. In fact, they went right up into modern-day Russia and to small portions of Turkey. It was a very widespread species until 13,000 years ago when humans started practicing agriculture. And you can see quite clearly, if you look at a map of the world, agriculture started in the Middle East, and this is obviously where the destruction of wild cheetah populations was initiated. And as farming spread into North Africa and into West Africa 7,000 years ago, and then into East Africa 2,500 years ago, only arriving in Southern Africa 1,500 years ago, slowly wild cheetah populations were decimated. And that was mainly because, of course, these cheetahs came into conflict with the newly arrived farmers, human-wildlife conflict. Cheetahs obviously kill sheep, goats, and young cattle. And then, of course, urbanization and agriculture. So there was a loss of safe space for wild cheetah populations. Some events that really further triggered their decline was the arrival of the horse. I mean, horses can run much further than cheetahs, so they were more easily chased down. And, of course, the horse coupled with the rifle spelled the end for many wild cheetah populations worldwide. Because agriculture only arrived in Southern Africa 1,500 years ago, we are the conservation stronghold for cheetah. We still have 4,000 cheetahs in mainly in Namibia, Botswana, and northern South Africa. So there's such low human densities in these parts of the world that we still have 4,000 cheetahs there. Then there's about 15 subpopulations that persist in Kenya, in East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, where they're relatively well protected by tourism. West Africa is not looking so good at the moment with the political instability. There's only about 250 out there. And then, of course, a tiny remnant population in Iran of about 20 individuals of Asiatic cheetahs that are hanging in there.
That's really interesting, and I hadn't ever thought about the connection between the arrival of the horse and further extermination of the cheetah population. That was really interesting. Thanks for that. And those sort of challenges that you've spoken into with respect to human-wildlife conflict, are those the kinds of challenges facing them today, or are there other challenges as well that the cheetahs of today are facing?
Yes, I mean, the entire global population that persists, there's still about 7,000 cheetahs left in the wild. All of those populations remain in decline. Some are stable, but most of them, the vast majority, remain in decline because obviously human populations continue to increase. Urbanization is on the increase. Agriculture is on the increase in Africa. So the only growing wild cheetah population that persists is the fenced population in Southern Africa. So what fencing basically does is it eliminates humans from the equation. So humans and their livestock and agriculture are fenced out, and cheetah populations are fenced in. So this means that you eliminate the major threat to wild cheetah populations through fencing. It's very frowned upon, especially in the context of the current paradigm for conservation. Currently the coexistence model is advocated. So, fencing is going against the current conservation paradigm, but it is proving to be the most effective technique to grow wild cheetah populations. And right now, fenced populations persist in southern Africa and in Malawi.
Interesting. Thanks, Vincent. And why why are cheetah as such an important species to conserve, and what crucial roles do they play in the ecosystems which they do exist in?
Well, the cheetah is a top order predator. It plays an important ecological role in regulating prey populations. Obviously, cheetahs exert different pressures on prey populations compared to leopards, lions, wild dogs. They feed on prey species that belong to different weight ranges. So they exert different evolutionary pressures on the prey spectrum. Most importantly, cheetahs are cursorial predators. So they actively identify weaker genetics in prey populations and eliminate those genetics. This makes them different from ambush predators. Ambush predators also play an important role in regulating prey populations, but they take the first animal that comes past them, regardless of its fitness. So that makes cheetahs more important in retaining healthy genetics in prey populations, in eliminating weaker genetics.
That's also incredible to hear about the fact that you might have these other predators which can sort of catch whatever comes across them, but the cheetah focus so clearly and so distinctly on the weaker animals within the herd or whatever prey species they may be hunting at the time.
That's correct, yes. And other cursorial predators that would do the same would be wolves and wild dogs. They also play an important role in eliminating those weaker genetics. Whereas the ambush predators, they specialize more in regulating prey numbers, but also from time to time will obviously identify weaker individuals, but less so than cursorial predators.
And Vincent, you've already mentioned the really fragmented distribution of cheetah across their current range. Of the range that is available to them today, what kind of landscapes, habitats, and different reserves are available to them?
So one of the misconceptions with wild cheetah with cheetahs is that they are an open grassland, open savanna specialist. And managing the metapopulation over the past 12 years, I've quickly realized that certainly isn't the case. The major limiting factor for wild cheetah populations is prey availability. Habitat is not a major limiting factor for cheetahs. Obviously, you won't find them in extremely dramatic mountain ranges because you simply won't find suitable prey up there. But the one habitat where you won't find cheetahs would be tropical forests, because they can't make use of their main talent. And cheetahs are a specialized high chase. They specialized in the way that they catch their animals. They catch the animals through high speed chases. They've evolved this incredible speed over millions of years. And so if they cannot utilize that ability, then they move into more preferable habitats. But we've got cheetahs in thicket vegetation in the Eastern Cape, where they persist and hunt very successfully in that thicker vegetation type. We know that they occurred there historically. The historical evidence for their presence there is crystal clear. And they also persist in, drier desert habitats. They do exceptionally well in the semi-deserts of the Karoo, in the deserts of the Kalahari. Water is not a major limiting factor for them. They do derive sufficient water from the blood of the prey animals that they feed on. And for that reason, you'd find them further away from river systems in drier habitats compared to leopards, which are more water dependent. You find them, of course, in savanna habitats, in places like Zululand, the Lowveld, where they coexist with other competing predators that persist in these environments at high densities. And you find them in mountainous areas. I mean, we've noticed in Mountain Zebra National Park, once they depleted the prey items in their preferred open habitats, they immediately moved onto the mountain slopes where they shifted their hunting techniques to ambush kudus on mountain slopes. And it's really interesting to spot them up in these, relatively rocky, quite dramatic mountain ranges, and they hunted kudu there without troubles. So they are extremely adaptable when it comes to different habitat types, and we move them. I mean, we've coordinated over 360 cheetah relocations between different habitat types, and habitat has never been a limiting factor. More recently, we reintroduced them into coastal dune forests in Mozambique, and it was the strangest thing following these cheetah, tracking them with telemetry in very dense and thick habitat, and finding them on red duiker kills, and observing them spending most of their time in relatively thick habitats. They are a truly remarkably adaptable species.
It's so intriguing to hear about their adaptability, because so often you do think of a cheetah as an open savanna grassland landscape predator. And you've already alluded to the scattered distribution of cheetahs across their range in different reserves, varying habitats. How does this scattered distribution of cheetah affect their conservation and the management of the population?
It severely affects their long-term persistence. So historically, wild cheetah populations would have been connected across massive landscapes, and there would have been natural metapopulation dynamics at play, dispersal, immigration, and they would have easily come across potential mates in this large connected population. What we have now is a number of isolated populations persisting, and in most of these populations, cheetah numbers are well below 50 individuals, well below genetically viable population size. So, and also what we've observed with cheetahs is that they continue to experience these boom-bust phases in all remnant populations. So the metapopulation itself is comprised of 69 reserves, the fenced metapopulation in southern Africa. And in that metapopulation, you'll have about 15 reserves, metapopulation reserves, where cheetahs are doing exceptionally well. And we'll remove cheetahs from those, what we call source reserves, and relocate them to sink reserves. So it really is a small number of source reserves, a small number of particularly fit and fertile cheetahs on the source reserves that are sustaining the population on the sink reserves. And over time, it's really interesting to see how individual populations within the metapopulation will go through source phases and will go through sink phases. So, for example, when we initiated this project, a major source population was Sanborna Game Reserve. Between 2012 and 2018, provided over 20 cheetahs surplus cheetahs to the metapopulation. Mountain Zebra National Park is another example. Provided over 25 cheetahs to the metapopulation. And then after that went through a sink phase where they were in turn now reliant on other newly created source reserves to supply them. So each individual reserve goes through boom and bust phases with regards to their cheetah population. And when they're in that boom phase, you've got to move them from that habitat when they reach carrying capacity to the sink reserves. And in 10 years' time, that sink reserve could in turn become a source reserve. So it's really metapopulation dynamics at play. And if you manage your population correctly and you're proactive with regards to wild cheetah management, then you can achieve population growth. Now, what's happening in the rest of Africa is there's no management. So each one of these reserves is effectively an isolated island of cheetahs. And if that little island of 20 to 50 cheetahs goes through a bust phase, then there's no natural supplementation from outside, and it's very difficult for that population to recover. So what we've realized is that in the context of the 21st century, wildlife management will be absolutely critical to the long-term conservation of wild cheetah populations. And that's because humans have totally transformed the landscape. We've farmed the land, we've tilled the land, we utilize 90% of the space to ourselves, and all that we are left with are these small little fragments of wild, natural habitat where cheetahs persist. And we have to responsibly manage those populations that are persisting.
Thanks, Vincent. That was a really in-depth look into even some of the other questions that I have lined up for you. And I think something that would be really useful for us to go to take one brief step back and ask, could you explain what is the concept of a metapopulation? What is it, and why is it so important for your management of cheetah specifically?
So basically, a metapopulation is a population of populations. So because humans have transformed the landscape and we have all these fragmented, isolated cheetah populations, which number between 3 and 40, all of these populations individually are not genetically viable in the long term. We know that genetic evidence accumulated from 40 years of genetic research across many different plant and animal taxa have demonstrated that inbreeding in the wild is a serious threat. If we want our populations to persist through the next few 100,000 years, and cheetahs, the modern day cheetah has only persisted for about 600,000 years. Technically, it should persist for another 400,000 years before it either goes extinct or evolves into something else. So if you want those cheetahs to persist for the next 400,000 years, they need sufficient genetic diversity to do that. So that genetic diversity will give them sufficient disease-fighting ability. So within your DNA, you have an MHC complex, a complex of genes that act together to fight diseases. And if your genetic diversity at that MHC complex is not sufficiently diverse, then you're not going to be able to fight off these diseases when you encounter them. And you can just imagine in the next 400,000 years, cheetahs are inevitably going to encounter diseases, and they have to have sufficient genetic diversity to do that. And not only fighting diseases, but also who knows what changes in habitat and climate await in the next 400,000 years. We need to make sure that our cheetahs have sufficient genetic diversity to adapt to those changes that will inevitably take place. So basically, each of these populations needs to have individuals swapped between them to ensure that genetic diversity is maintained and, if possible, actually increased. So a metapopulation, the whole concept comes from butterfly research in Scandinavia, where butterflies would fly between little forest patches in an agricultural landscape, and then they do well in some of the patches. They wouldn't do well in other patches. So you had your source patches, you had your sink patches. Then you had your patches where these butterflies were temporarily extinct. But overall, over time, the metapopulation, the natural metapopulation, remained connected and viable as a whole. So basically, historically, the cheetah populations would have been connected through dispersal, immigration. And now we have to implement human-mediated dispersal to ensure their persistence. Because if we don't intervene, then we're going to lose at least 60 to 70% of remnant wild cheetah populations in the next 200 to 300 years.
Thanks, Vincent. That was really interesting. I think a few of the really important take-homes from how you just defined it was the fact that a population is made up of multiple metapopulations within it, and that it is important that there is connectivity between the populations, and that there is, between each metapopulation, you'll find slight differences. And even I really enjoyed your the thought of thinking of them as some as sink populations and some as source populations. It really gives me this sort of vast overview of you almost as this conductor or this person moving pieces on a chessboard to try and make everything sort of connect and come together. As the manager of the Cheetah Metapopulation Initiative, where do you operate and which cheetah metapopulations are you currently managing?
At this point in time, most of our work is limited to South Africa, because it's a highly developed African nation. The landscape has been subject to a good 1,000 years of agriculture. Because our human population numbers are relatively high in South Africa, there's been a necessitated fencing. So right now, 95% of the reserves that we work with are totally fenced. So by law in South Africa, if you want to reintroduce a wild predator, lion, leopard, cheetah, hyena, by law you have to fence. So we started off working exclusively with a fenced population. In 2020, we started to attempt our first reintroductions into unfenced systems. So we continued with a fenced approach into Malawi. Malawi has exceptionally high human densities. So there we had to fence before the cheetahs were reintroduced into those national parks. But more recently, we moved into Zambia and Mozambique, where there is no fencing. And so even though these reserves are fenced, they're still isolated from other protected areas. The cheetahs can't move out of there without hitting towns and cities and agricultural landscapes. So we have more recently started moving into Zambia, Mozambique, and attempting our first reintroductions into unfenced systems. And it's proved to be very challenging, because inevitably those cheetahs are going to come into conflict with humans.
And so you mentioned that you mainly work with fenced reserves, and it was interesting to hear about the other challenges you've experienced in unfenced reserves. But what are some of the main challenges, besides maintaining genetic diversity? What are some of the main challenges that you are facing managing cheetahs in fenced reserves, like, for example, and beyond Pindar Private Game Reserve?
So cheetahs do incredibly well in these fence protected areas. So as you mentioned earlier, I serve essentially as a control tower, directing the flow of cheetah between all these protected areas. Right now, despite the presence of competing predators in these fence protected areas, cheetahs are doing well. So our population, our fenced metapopulation is growing by 8% per annum. So we're reaching capacity in South Africa. So the major challenge is to identify new safe space for the release of our cheetahs. And that's proving difficult because, fencing is largely confined to South Africa. So now we're having to take these wild, ecologically functional cheetahs into unfenced systems and attempt to grow their population numbers there. And that is proving very challenging because cheetahs are a wide-ranging species, especially in the first 6 months post-release. When you release them into a new habitat, they are going to explore. And because they haven't been present in that habitat for a very long period of time, typically between 10 and 50 years, they don't have a communication network in place at that reintroduction site. So, for example, in Mozambique, we reintroduced 20 cheetahs into 900,000 hectares. How are these cheetahs going to find each other there? Because cheetahs were extirpated there about 80 years ago. So when cheetahs still persisted in that environment, they had dedicated communication hubs, normally a prominent tree in the landscape or a prominent rock in the landscape, where the cheetahs, each individual cheetah visits that communication hub every week. So, and that cheetah, whether it's male or female, will go there and it will defecate and it will scent mark and it will advertise its presence in the landscape. And that sort of keeps the cheetah populations there. Males want to be around females because they're programmed to copulate. Females want to be in the presence of males because they also evolutionarily programmed to procreate. And what we find when we release them into these unfenced systems is there's no communication network and they don't find each other. And they roam widely, especially in the first 6 months. I mean, we've had some cheetahs released into Mozambique that have simply walked back to South Africa. We've had some cheetahs in Mozambique that have walked into cities. And when they hit the outskirts of these urban areas, they obviously turn around and try and walk back. But obviously, prey populations have been decimated in human environments, and some of them, before they can get back to a protected area, they literally starve. Snaring is a major issue. Obviously, snares are not put out to capture cheetah for for bushmeat, but they are indirectly captured by snares and gin traps. In these reserves, in these open systems where we've reintroduced cheetahs in Mozambique and Zambia, we've had terrible losses due to snaring. And even within some of our fenced reserves in South Africa, there's one particular reserve in Zululand where we've lost 21 cheetahs to snaring. So that is one of the major challenges that we are facing at the moment. Overpopulation and low success at reintroducing into unfenced systems.
And how would you overcome some of these challenges? I mean, you've mentioned issues with there is no other way to overcome the lack of communication hubs in these reserves other than introducing cheetah. So that totally makes sense. But how would you overcome issues of cheetah moving far out of the range in which you've reintroduced them, or issues with snaring? And then I guess also another challenge is actually just moving a cheetah. So what does it even take to move a cheetah?
Yeah, it's a major challenge. Just to give you some context, between 1965 and 1992, just over 200 wild cheetahs were reintroduced into reserves in South Africa, and 7 of the 8 reintroduction efforts failed completely. Phinda was the very first successful wild cheetah reintroduction anywhere in the world. So even within the fence systems of South Africa, we really struggled initially because we didn't know anything about cheetah reintroduction. And we learned some hard lessons. We learned the importance of bomas and maintaining good fences and good post-release monitoring. Now, when we reintroduce into the unfenced systems, we've experienced tremendous losses. What we find is it's just a numbers game. So if you keep persisting, and we have this growing metapopulation. I mean, we've got 40 animals per year that we can comfortably make available for reintroduction efforts. And if you just keep persisting and keep on making these animals available for these reintroductions into the bigger, open, unfenced systems, eventually the communication hubs will become established. And core areas for cheetah conservation will become established. What you can do to prevent the wide-ranging behavior is have helicopters and veterinarians on standby, and we've done this in Mozambique. We literally have 3 helicopters on site, and we have a certain budget available for monitoring the cheetahs using those helicopters, and we have a vet permanently on standby to return the escapees and bring them back. I mean, you can imagine the costs involved are just absolutely massive. So and the losses, I mean, it sounds so unethical just to effectively just release large numbers of cheetahs into a system where we know we're going to experience these high mortalities. So, the snaring is something you can do very little about unless you start fencing and fence communities out, which is certainly not popular. So, I mean, we're investigating the use of radars at detecting fences at the moment, finding more money to employ more anti-poaching units to eliminate fences from the landscape. But effectively, there's very little that you can do apart from, keeping on bashing away and also just learning how to get large carnivores to coexist with humans, and investigating ways to make protected areas more economically viable so that they benefit local communities, and South Africa is a classic example of this. In South Africa, starting off with Phinda in the early 90s, we've established all these protected areas across the landscape, and we found that ecotourism can actually outcompete agriculture from a financial perspective. I mean, a reserve like Phinda, for example, makes more money than it would if you switched it back to cattle farming. So just using using ecotourism as a useful model to increase our protected area network. I mean, I see that as the way forward in future for effectively protecting wildlife populations.
And you've mentioned, Vincent, that Phinda was one of the first reserve to reintroduce cheetah again. And what is the significance of Phinda's cheetah population in the broader context of the metapopulation initiative and management that you do?
Well, Phinda have given us a very effective template for managing wild cheetah populations. They have a fantastic infrastructure. They've got a good, well-maintained fences that are inspected on a weekly basis. They've got a very good cheetah boma setup, so that any cheetahs coming into Phinda, can settle into their new environment for a short period of time, breaking their homing instinct, breaking that instinct to walk back to where they originally come from. But the major tool that Phinda have in their arsenal is effective management and monitoring. So Phinda cheetahs they have a dedicated monitoring team. The cheetahs are collared. They regularly observed. They have a very effective liaison between the monitoring team and the safari guides who go out on a daily, taking guests out to see the cheetah. Any sightings are immediately reported. That information is documented. They maintain a very good cheetah tracking tool, so they know exactly how many cheetahs they have on their property. They can immediately detect when there is a surplus of cheetahs. And, this obviously can have knock-on effects on prey populations. So whenever Phinda has a surplus, they make these animals available to the metapopulation. Whenever the monitoring team on Phinda detects potential for inbreeding, they contact the metapopulation managers and they bring in new unrelated individuals to ensure that the population remains genetically healthy. So it's very effective demographic and genetic management that has been the secret to success at Phinda. Of course, Phinda cheetah are highly desirable because they are well managed from a genetic perspective, but also because they are tourist friendly. I mean, these cheetahs bump into game drive vehicles on a regular basis. And this is great because what they're effectively doing is they're paying their rent through good game viewing. If you eliminated tourism on Phinda, those cheetahs wouldn't have any form of economic value, then the place would probably very quickly resort back to livestock farming. So Phinda cheetahs are fantastic animals. They have high tourism value. They know lion, they know leopard, they know hyena, they know competing predators. So they are truly tough, ecologically functional wild cheetahs. And they represent the epitome of a metapopulation cheetah in that regard. That is what we are aiming for, the cheetahs that we have on Phinda.
So that was a really lovely overview. Thanks, Vincent. And so would you say that besides all of the really important monitoring that you mentioned, is that knowledge of other predators really something that's quite crucial when it comes to relocating or translocating a cheetah? The areas that you are translocating them to, particularly in some of the other ones you've been active in, like Mozambique and Zambia, are there other predators in these areas too, which the cheetah would have to be wary of?
Yes, absolutely. So more than 50% of natural mortality in wild cheetah populations is due to competing predators. So the cubs are killed by brown hyenas, spotted hyenas, leopards, lion, wild dogs, jackals, even elephants trample them from time to time. Vultures spot them from the air and come down and kill them. So the cubs are highly susceptible to predation. But and therefore cheetah moms have to find good den sites to effectively hide them away from these competing predators. And these den sites are often in very thick habitat or in dense riverine vegetation or on mountain slopes. But once the cubs get through that initial danger period and they become mobile, then they get their first exposure to these competing predators. And their mothers are exceptionally good at training them on how to avoid the competing predators. So cheetahs have evolved a strategy of giving birth to big litters, much bigger litters than you'll see in lions and leopards, because most of these cubs are inevitably killed by competing predators. But when they see their fellow siblings being killed by lion, leopard, hyena, this knowledge of these dangers out there becomes imprinted on them, and they become a lot more vigilant when they move through the bush. So they constantly, if you watch a cheetah on Pindar moving through the bush, it's constantly turning around, looking around it. It's very cognizant of its environment. And then so that animal is 100% ecologically functional. That's what you want from a wild cheetah. You want an animal that is highly alert to the presence of competing predators that actively kill them. And when we move these highly vigilant, alert cheetahs to new protected areas where they bump into lion, leopard, spotted hyena, wild dogs, they come with that ingrained knowledge of these predators. So they are aware of these dangers. And more than 95% of our reintroduction sites have these competing predators. So yes, we only have about 2 or 3 what we call soft reserves that have no competing predators at all. So those are wild cheetahs running around with no hyena, leopard, lion coming after them. And when we take those soft cheetahs to a reserve like Pindar, inevitably they really do struggle.
And if I may also ask you to touch on what does it actually take to move a cheetah? You've mentioned all of this moving, translocating, metapopulation management. What goes into a major translocation effort?
So there's quite a lot of bureaucracy involved. Obviously, cheetahs are highly desired as pet animals, so governments make a concerted effort to implement legislation to prevent wild cheetahs from going into captivity. So we first of all have to get permits. A permit from the receiving reserve, an import permit, and then a permit from the donating reserve. And once those permits are issued, hopefully the paperwork can be sorted quickly, but it typically takes between 6 weeks and a month to get that paperwork in order. Then you got to bring in the veterinarians to mobilize those wild cheetahs. Obviously, you can't catch them without them being immobilized. And this is where we find cheetah are particularly susceptible to immobilization complications. We lose 7% of the wild cheetah that we relocate to immobilization complications. They don't like being chased. They're easily stressed. And capturing cheetah in the wild is extremely challenging. You have to get the veterinarian to within 20, 30 meters. Many of our cheetahs are so wild that we have to capture them utilizing helicopters. So that is the major challenge, is capturing them and getting them into the transport crates out without the cheetahs overheating or suffering from chronic stress to the extent that it actually kills them. So, yes, and then once you've got them in the crates and they've cooled down and they've been reversed, the immobilization drugs have been reversed, then you have the long journey between the metapopulation reserves. And these drives can last anything from 45 minutes to 55 hours. Our longest relocation was between South Africa and Malawi, where we relocated an individual 55 hours over 3 days. So yes, but once they're in the crates and they've recovered from their mobilization, they generally transport quite well. They're relatively relaxed inside the crates. Unlike lion and leopard, they pretty much sit still and don't make too much of a noise. They don't jump around too much in the crates, and they relocate relatively well after you've immobilized them. So yes, it's a massive logistical operation, but we've had great success, with the 360 cheetah relocations that we've coordinated over the past 12 years.
Thanks for that insight, Vincent. It was really interesting to hear of all the bits and pieces that go into simply moving one cheetah from one reserve to another or from one country to another. Now, our last question for the podcast is, arguably the biggest news in the world regarding cheetah conservation right now is the translocation of cheetah from Southern Africa to India and their introduction to Kuno National Park. The move has produced some robust debate over the past few months. So I wanted to ask what your involvement is in the project, and can you give us an outline of the project's short and long-term goals and some of the challenges it may face along the way?
Yes, so this is an intergovernmental project between the South African government and the Indian government. The Indian government is aware that we have this growing wild cheetah population in Southern Africa. They're also aware that it's extremely challenging to reintroduce cheetahs. We learned the hard way in South Africa. We know that 200, exactly, I think it's just over 200 wild cheetahs were lost between 1965 and 1992 when we were learning the process of cheetah reintroduction. As a result of the lessons that we learned in that very difficult process, we have now increased our metapopulation from, the first few founders on Punda, which was just 12 animals, to a current metapopulation of 500 individuals. So they've realized that, there's absolutely no way that they can reintroduce the correct Asiatic subspecies. There's just 20 cheetahs left in Iran. Since the 1970s, the Iranian governments and the Indian governments have been speaking about, potentially sourcing cheetah from Iran and swapping Asiatic lions from India. India is the only country in Asia that still has remnant lion population. So essentially swapping lions for cheetahs. This just never came to fruition. It never managed to reach an agreement. And also it's ethically prohibitive, to remove animals from a small population in Iran and reintroduce them into India because, you're compromising the Iranian population. And secondly, we know that it takes many hundreds of cheetah to get a reintroduction right into a country. Sourcing from Iran was absolutely out. So the major controversy is that they effectively are going to be reintroducing the incorrect subspecies, an African subspecies. The closest African subspecies to the Asiatic cheetah is the West African cheetah. And it's just absolutely impossible from a logistical and a bureaucratic perspective to go into countries like Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, northern Benin, and to source cheetahs from places like that. There's a lot of extremist activity in those areas, and the cheetah numbers are in decline there. So it's also ethically prohibitive, but also logistically and bureaucratically impossible to source from those countries. India has therefore turned to Southern Africa because they know they're going to need a regular supply of cheetahs from South Africa to establish a population in India. So India, obviously cheetahs occurred there historically. The last wild cheetah that was directly observed in India was, shot in 1948. There were reported sightings until the late 1960s, but it was officially actually declared extinct in the early 50s. They have approached South Africa for our wild cheetahs. It's the incorrect subspecies. But it still serves the same ecological role. We've learned from our experiences moving cheetahs in Southern Africa that they adapt quite easily to new habitats. The Kuno National Park is very much a bushveld savanna reserve. There's many species in Kuno that plant species that you'll find in Zululand. It was remarkable. Some of the grasses are exactly the same. You got your ziziphus, you got your acacia nilotica. It was interesting to see the overlap in plant diversity, and the habitat structure is very similar, if not almost the same. So obviously there's sufficient prey in these reserves. There's spotted deer, which is of the right size for cheetah. They have 9,000 spotted deer in Kuno National Park. One of the major concerns with Kuno is the high leopard density. At 75,000 hectares, which means it's 3 times the size of Punda. They have 90 leopards there. So leopards are responsible for about 9% of cheetah mortalities. So inevitably, we are going to lose cheetahs to predation by leopards. The other major concern, of course, is that Kuno is not fenced at all. So India has a completely different philosophy to wildlife management. They do still try and retain connectivity between their protected areas. They do still have wildlife corridors that are actively utilized by species such as tigers. In the early 2000s, a tiger actually naturally moved through Kuno. So they haven't resorted to fencing. What they do have there, instead of utilizing wildlife fences, they have social fences. So they have a compensation scheme for for livestock losses. So basically, if you're a farmer on the outskirts of Kuno National Park and a cheetah comes in and it eats one of your goats or one of your sheep, the government will reimburse you, so you'll submit a claim, you'll liaise with the local forestry officer, he will inspect the carcass of the animal that you've lost, and you'll be paid out within 2 weeks. So they have a compensation scheme in place, something that we don't have in place in Africa, anywhere in Africa. So this gives us hope that the coexistence model could work for cheetah in India. We know that it has worked for their tiger numbers. Their tiger numbers have increased from 1,400 in 2006 to a current population of 3,000 tigers. So the social fences and the coexistence approach definitely has worked in India, and we've got a lot to learn from them in that regard. But it's going to be extremely challenging. We're going to have to send at least 100 cheetahs in the next 10 years to India. Mistakes will be made, animals will be lost. And it's important that everyone involved in this reintroduction is fully cognizant of this. We know that even with our fenced reserves in South Africa, we had 27 years of failure before we got cheetah reintroduction right. But in the long term, we can be quite confident that if you had to visit India as a tourist in 500 years' time, they will have a cheetah population established there. The resources have been made available by the Indian government to do this. And you'll probably find a good population of up to 500 individuals in India in 500 years' time. We're just going to have to go through an extremely painful period initially with these initial reintroductions. And if we can burn through that, then I'm sure that we can achieve success with the reintroduction in India within the next 2 decades.
Thank you so much for that overview, Vincent. Again, it's lovely to hear you speak into sort of the long-term plan, the challenges that you might face, but also that there are some things in place to deal with those challenges, like the compensation of losses to livestock, and the fact that India are obviously also desperate to make this whole translocation work. It's been so lovely hearing from you about the overview of cheetah, their history, the challenges facing them, but also the incredible work that yourself and your team and reserves are doing to protect them. And something that I'd like to briefly go back to is your mentions of sometimes when you hear about how much goes into a cheetah translocation and what can go wrong, the complications involved, that it may even seem unethical, but at the end of the day, the alternative is extinction, which I think everyone feels is simply not an option. And the concept that you brought in of persistence, the persistence that you show and all the reserves show will ensure the long-term persistence of the species if we are willing to put in the effort to conserve, translocate, reestablish, then the persistence of the species will hopefully be reached.
Absolutely, Josh. And, the real heroes in this conservation story are the people that are creating safe space. It's all of those private game reserves and national parks across South Africa. 90% of these reserves were historically utilized for agriculture. And a lot of determined people have gone into these environments. They've cleared the land of the livestock. They've cleared the crops. They've removed all the remnants of human infrastructure. And they've reestablished not only cheetahs, but other historically occurring mammals, And what we've seen in post-apartheid South Africa is a remarkable wildlife recovery. It will be very unfortunate if we keep this model to ourselves. It's imperative that we share our experiences from South Africa with our colleagues in other countries so that they can also initiate and oversee the recovery of wildlife populations in their countries within the context of the realities of the 21st century. I mean, to achieve, conservation successes when we know human populations are doubling every 20 years in the country where we live, I mean, it really is something wonderful. And the fact that the Indians are keen to initiate cheetah reintroduction in their country is something that we need to celebrate. It means that they take conservation seriously. And, this is going to create wonderful opportunities, not only for cheetah conservation, but for the conservation of the grassland landscapes where cheetah persist in India. So it's very exciting. There's going to be lots of challenges ahead, but thanks very much for the opportunity to share my thoughts and ideas with you, Josh, and I hope that the audience enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you, Vincent. It was a real pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to Leave Our World a Better Place. Don't forget to subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode. If you'd like to find out more about And Beyond, please log on to our website at andbeyond.com.